When racist woman poisoned Big Shaq's dog, it wasn't just an attack, it was a warning wrapped in silence. But what she didn't know, Big Shaq doesn't bark back, he builds the storm in silence. And when the truth finally spoke, it shattered everything she thought was untouchable. What happened next? No one saw coming. She walked her dog at the same time every morning, a tiny white fluff ball, with trembling legs, and an anxious yip. Her path always curved past Shaq's driveway. She never looked directly at him, just offered that practiced smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes, before moving on. He started to understand her rhythm, the way predators sometimes circle quietly before striking. Blue watched her too, not with anger, with confusion, the same confusion that dogs feel when something isn't what it pretends to be. One evening, as Shaq sat on the porch, Blue resting at his feet, the wind shifted. The scent of cut grass mingled with something sharper, chemical, faint, but enough to turn his head. Blue lifted his nose too, nostrils twitching, and slowly backed away from a corner of the yard. Shaq walked over and knelt, pressing his hand into the damp earth. Nothing obvious, but something was off. He didn't say a word, just looked up slowly toward Joanna's house. The blinds moved. Just a flicker. But it was enough. The peace of that morning was gone. Not violently, not loudly, but the kind of gone that you feel in your gut before you can explain it. Something had shifted, and as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the shadows stretched long across the pavement, Shaq sat back in his chair and watched the light in Joanna's window flicker off. He didn't speak, didn't move, but something inside him had begun to listen. And in that quiet, the storm began to rise. There was something engineered about Joanna Millfield's life, like it had been arranged rather than lived. Her house stood polished and pristine, the lawn trimmed within an inch of botanical perfection, and the front garden sculpted into elegant shapes that seemed less about beauty and more about control. She was new money, the kind that worked obsessively to mimic old elegance without ever understanding the weight of it. Her pearls looked real enough, her car a conservative silver Lexus, and her wardrobe, pastel-collared, pressed, seemed curated from an HOA-approved catalog. But no matter how carefully she smiled, it never touched her eyes. In the weeks after her arrival, she did everything by the book, but in a way that made the book feel like a weapon. She introduced herself at a neighborhood brunch she hosted on her front lawn, complete with monogrammed cocktail napkins and soft jazz humming from a hidden Bluetooth speaker. She called the gathering a community refresh. It sounded harmless, even nice. But beneath the organic lemonade and micro scones, something colder stirred. Joanna didn't ask questions. She made statements, observations disguised as compliments, all delivered with that measured voice and that detached smile. Shaq had shown up late, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, with a tiny grease stain from working on his fence. He'd shaken hands, made small talk. Joanna greeted him like he was an exhibit, her voice rising half a note when she said, "So nice of you to come." And then, while handing him a drink, she said softly, "You used to be much quieter, didn't you?" It was said with a tilt of the head, like she was remembering something benign, but the air around her curdled just a little. Shaq held her gaze for half a beat longer than necessary. Then he smiled politely and walked away. It didn't take long for the complaints to start. The first HOA notice came in a plain envelope, tucked into his mailbox like a church flyer. The letter was short, mechanical. His mailbox apparently was not aligned to code height regulations. The measurements were off by less than an inch. Shaq fixed it the next day, even though it had stood in the same position for 2 years without issue. The second notice came a week later. This time, his garbage can had been cited for being visibly unkempt and improperly positioned post-collection. There was even a time-stamped photo attached, blurry, angled, but unmistakably taken from across the street. He adjusted it, then started documenting everything: photos, videos, daily routines. Not because he wanted a fight, but because something in Joanna's methods made it clear she was building a case, slow and silent. Shaq didn't talk to his neighbors about it. He knew the signs. Some of them were already shifting, growing colder, more reserved. Not openly hostile, just distant. The way people get when they're afraid of standing next to the wrong person. They still waved, still smiled, but the warmth was thinning, replaced by something cautious, something learned. Blue noticed it too. The pit bull, once enthusiastic to explore the yard, now hesitated by the edges. especially near the strip of grass closest to Joanna's property line. At first it was just a pause, then a full stop, then a refusal. One morning Blue simply sat at the threshold, tail still, ears low, refusing to move past the gate. Shaq tried coaxing him, even carried him to the middle of the yard, but the dog pulled back, tense and silent. Shaq knelt down and pressed his hand into the ground. Nothing obvious, no glass, no thorns, no chemical scent he could place. But there was something faint, something unnatural in the soil. He couldn't name it, but it lingered on his skin after he stood. He washed his hands twice that day. It wasn't just the letters or the behavior shifts. It was the small things. The way his morning newspaper would end up crumpled near the street, instead of the porch, where it had always landed. The time his sprinkler system mysteriously reset and flooded the far corner of his yard. The anonymous note taped to his front door reminding him that compliance ensures community harmony. Every action was subtle, deniable, but none of it felt random. Joanna never confronted him directly. She didn't need to. Her arsenal was paperwork, perception, and precision. She smiled when she passed him in her linen skirts and spotless sneakers, nodding just enough to seem civil. But her gaze was empty, her kindness hollowed out by intent. Shaq started watching more closely. He set a camera near the porch, not obvious but not fully hidden either. A quiet observer. Within days, he caught movement at odd hours, small shadows near his property line, quick flickers of light from across the street, the silhouette of Joanna, walking her dog far later than usual, always circling the same part of his lawn. He began timing her routes. She was consistent, ritualistic. Morning walk, at 7, evening at 10. Always past his house, never once letting her eyes meet his unless he made it impossible to avoid. Her silence wasn't avoidance, it was calculation. A predator doesn't announce itself. It watches, learns, measures weakness. And all the while, Blue grew more anxious. He started sleeping closer to the door, became reactive to certain scents on Shaq's clothes. After walking through the neighborhood, one evening, he wouldn't eat. Not because he was sick, because he was on alert, watching the window, listening for something only he could hear. Shaq's routines remained steady. He watered the lawn, cooked breakfast, waved at kids biking past. But he moved differently, more aware. He logged every HOA notice, saved every flyer, kept a journal, not of thoughts, of patterns, timelines, behaviors. He wasn't planning revenge. He was preparing for proof. Because that's what Joanna's smile really was, a mask stretched over strategy. She operated through suggestion, not accusation, made others believe they were the problem. Her power wasn't force, it was manipulation. She didn't need to convince everyone, just enough to make Shaq look like the one unraveling. And slowly, the dread began to settle. Not the loud kind, the quiet, needling kind that eats at your sense of reality, that makes you question what's real and what's orchestrated. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't lash out. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous fight is the one you can't name. The final confirmation came one late afternoon. Shaq had just returned from a walk with Blue. As they approached the house, he spotted Joanna at her mailbox. She was holding an envelope, but not reading it, just standing, staring across the street at his yard. Blue growled. Not loud, low, a sound like a warning wrapped in confusion. Joanna looked up, met Shaq's gaze for half a second, and smiled. That same smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes. Blue was alive, but just barely. The vet said he had a fighting chance, but the next few days would decide everything. The antidote was working, but his kidneys were bruised by the attack. Shaq spent his nights at the clinic and his mornings at home, waiting for the neighborhood to stir, not for comfort, but for observation. It started with the eyes. Joanna Millfield had always looked with scrutiny, but he hadn't realized how often, until now. She had a habit of turning her head halfway, never fully, never directly, but enough to track movement. She'd glance at Blue like someone checking the weather before stepping outside, assessing what inconvenience she might encounter. And when she looked at Shaq, it wasn't hatred in her eyes. It was entitlement, the kind of gaze that said, "You don't belong in the same piece I built for myself." Her interactions with others were different. She'd lean in when she spoke to the younger couple next door, laugh too loud at jokes too weak. But when Shaq passed, that laughter stopped. Conversations dipped in volume, smiles tightened. It wasn't what they said, it was what they withheld. He noticed small things now. The neighbor across the street used to wave with both hands when her twins were outside. Now it was a nod. The guy 2 doors down, Greg, who once asked for help building his deck, now avoided eye contact altogether. The warmth hadn't disappeared. It had been redirected, siphoned off and rerouted. Joanna hadn't said a word about him out loud, but her silence had done enough. On Tuesday, Shaq caught the retired mailman, Earl, at the corner gas station. Earl was a slow talker, one of those men who always seemed like he had more to say than he ever let out. They struck up a casual exchange about the heat wave and bad roadwork near Maine, but somewhere between gas pumps and convenience store coffee, the conversation turned. "That woman on your block," Earl said, leaning a little closer like the air itself might snitch. "Joanna Millfield, right?" Shaq nodded, cautious. "She's been on 3 different blocks in the last 5 years. Always in early, always on the HOA board. By month 2. By month 6, there's trouble. Something always goes wrong. A broken window. Poisoned pets. Anonymous calls, but never enough to stick. She's smart. Leaves no fingerprints. Just chaos." Shaq didn't say anything. He just looked down at the sidewalk, the cracks beneath his boots, the way dust gathered in corners no broom ever touched. Earl continued, softer now. "Word is, she left her last place after a neighbor's dog died. Vet said it was old age, but that dog was only 3. Shaq didn't need to hear more. The chill had already settled. The pattern was too clean to ignore now. It wasn't paranoia. It was a loop repeating itself. It was just the next name on a list she never wrote down. Back at home, he went through the security camera feeds. He'd set them up a year ago, just for general peace of mind. 3 cameras. One at the porch, one angled down the driveway, one on the side yard, facing the direction of Joanna's property. All had worked fine, until now. The porch cam showed Blue that morning, walking unsteadily before collapsing. The footage was clean, uninterrupted. The driveway feed showed nothing unusual. No intrusions, no strangers. But when he opened the side cam, his stomach dropped. The file was empty. Not corrupted. Not missing. Just black. The timestamp showed it had recorded, but there was nothing but a blank screen from midnight until noon the day before Blue collapsed. He ran diagnostics. No glitch. The lens hadn't been covered. The software hadn't failed. The only explanation left was interference. Deliberate tampering. Someone had either blocked the signal or scrambled the feed. It wasn't hard to do for someone who knew what they were doing. A simple jammer bought online. A pocket-sized device. It wouldn't take more than 2 minutes to kill a signal for just long enough. The realization was sharp. Someone had stood near his home, on that side of the yard, the one Blue had avoided, and interfered with the one eye that might have seen them. It wasn't just the poison that was intentional. It was everything. Shaq sat back in his chair, the footage still looping its void on the screen, and whispered to no one in particular. Racism doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears heels, carries a clipboard, and waves at your mailbox. He knew now this wasn't just about Blue. The poison had never just been in the bowl, or the grass, or the soil. It had been in the atmosphere from the start. In Joanna's half-smiles, in the notices, in the shifting gazes of neighbors, once warm, now hesitant. This was a performance, and Joanna had written the script, but she hadn't counted on him being patient. She hadn't counted on him being quiet. She hadn't counted on him listening. So Shaq began his own performance. The first thing he did was adjust the camera angles. He added 2 more, one disguised in a bird feeder, another buried near the corner post of his fence. Both had night vision. Both had motion sensors. No lights, no sounds, just quiet observation. Next, he visited the vet again. Not just for Blue's checkups, but to speak with the assistant who'd handled his intake. She confirmed his suspicion. Blue had antifreeze in his system. Traceable. Enough to suggest exposure. Not ingestion. That meant Blue hadn't lapped it up willingly. He'd stepped through it, sniffed it, absorbed it through touch. Shaq asked her, without naming names, if a person could pour antifreeze into grass without being noticed. She nodded slowly. It's colorless. Odors faint. Disappears fast in daylight. Back home, he checked the grass where Blue had collapsed. The earth there was still disturbed, looser, like something had been spilled and soaked quickly. He scooped a soil sample into a sealed jar, not because he expected it to be admissible in court, but because it was part of the story, part of the record. He started cataloging everything. Each HOA notice now lived in a folder labeled Millfield. Each neighbor's name was scribbled on a wallboard in his garage, with color-coded marks next to those who'd shifted behavior. He didn't judge them. He understood fear. He just didn't want to mistake it for fact. He changed his routine. No more predictable walks. No more porch breakfasts. No signs of weakness. He mowed the lawn with precision, hosed the sidewalk twice a week, repainted the porch railing, let her see him pristine, compliant, civil, the perfect neighbor. Because if Joanna's game was optics, then he'd give her a reflection, so flawless it'd be impossible to distort. But the silence between them deepened. She stopped waving, stopped smiling, and once, just once, he saw her watching from behind her curtain, the edge of her blouse visible, her face barely shadowed, but her hands, they were clenched. Shaq knew then that she could feel it. The shift, the presence of something she hadn't anticipated, resistance that didn't fight back the way she expected. Not loud, not public, just present, unshakable. He didn't need her to confess. He didn't even need to catch her in the act. All he needed was for the story to reach the right ears. Because predators like Joanna don't thrive on action. They thrive on isolation. They count on their targets breaking, reacting, shouting, giving them a reason to flip the script. But this time, there would be no outburst. No headline. Just evidence. And patience. And the quiet unraveling of a woman who had spent too many years thinking her smile could bury a truth that had just begun to rise. Blue had woken up slower than usual. Not sick, just sluggish. He didn't rush to the kitchen like he normally did when Shaq pulled the eggs from the fridge. He waited at the doorway instead, sitting upright, ears alert but not moving. Shaq took note but said nothing. Maybe the heat, maybe just age. Blue wasn't a pup anymore, after all. They'd just finished breakfast. Same routine as always. 2 eggs sunny side up for Blue. No seasoning, with a little corner of toast. Shaq always broke off from his own plate. Blue ate it slow, then wandered outside while Shaq stayed back to rinse the dishes. The house was filled with the low hum of jazz, blinds open, breeze trailing through the screen door. If you'd pressed pause on the moment, it would have looked like peace. Then the sound came. Not a bark, not a growl. A thud. Shaq turned fast. His first instinct was that Blue had knocked over a flower pot again. He'd done it twice last week chasing squirrels. But when he stepped out, the world shifted. Blue was lying in the grass, near the garden edge. His legs twitched once, then again. His eyes were wide, glassy, unfocused. Foam had begun to collect at the corners of his mouth, thick and unnatural. His body convulsed once, violently, then slumped. Shaq didn't speak, didn't yell. He moved with the kind of calm that only comes from trauma, muscle memory shaped by heartbreaks, too deep to explain. He scooped Blue up into his arms with no hesitation, the dog's weight pressing heavy against his chest, and carried him to the truck without a word. The drive to the vet felt like a different kind of silence. Not peaceful, not still, but hollow. Shaq kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Blue's chest, counting the shallow breaths. The lights blurred past, the radio off, the world tuned out. When he burst through the doors of the vet clinic, the staff didn't need explanation. One look at Blue, and they moved. A stretcher appeared. Voices layered over each other. Someone called for the doctor. The words all blurred. But Shaq didn't move. He stood in the middle of that sterile waiting room, his hands clenched at his sides, jaw locked, face unreadable. He didn't cry. Not yet. Not here. It was nearly 40 minutes before someone spoke to him again. The vet was a younger woman, early 40s maybe, with tired eyes and a voice softened by years of delivering bad news. She sat down across from him, clipboard resting on her knee, her gaze cautious. "We've stabilized him," she said, her words wrapped in clinical calm. "But it's serious." Shaq nodded once, a tight gesture. His blood work shows renal failure, rapid onset. The symptoms and the timing suggest ethylene glycol poisoning. Shaq blinked slowly. "What's that?" "Antifreeze," she answered. "It's lethal in small doses, especially for dogs. It's sweet, which makes it more dangerous. Some pets will drink it without hesitation if it's left somewhere accessible. It doesn't take much." There was a long pause between them. Shaq's expression didn't change, but the silence in him deepened. She continued. "Slower now. Given his size and the amount in his system, this wasn't accidental. Someone meant for this to happen. Shaq didn't move. His eyes were on the wall behind her, not seeing it, just feeling the weight of her words land like stones in his chest. "We're doing everything we can," she said gently. "He's strong, he's fighting, but we're in the early stages. It's hour by hour now." He gave a single nod. It was all he could manage. The vet rose, gave him a moment, then led him to a small room in the back. A quiet space where Blue lay on a soft pad, an IV hooked to his leg, a monitor tracing his heartbeat. The beeps were slow, steady, haunting. Shaq sat beside him and placed a hand on his side. Blue's breathing was shallow, but his body reacted to the touch, just slightly. A flicker of awareness, recognition, loyalty, even now. For the next several hours, Shaq didn't leave his side. He didn't call anyone, didn't check his phone. He just sat in that room, hand resting on Blue, talking in the kind of voice that doesn't need an audience. He told stories, little ones, things that wouldn't matter to anyone else but somehow felt important to say. He talked about the first time Blue rode in the truck, terrified of the seatbelt harness, but too proud to whimper, the time he chased a crow halfway across the neighborhood, the way he'd sit perfectly still during thunderstorms, eyes closed, as if listening to something ancient. And then, slowly, his voice cracked. Not loudly, not even enough to be called weeping, just a fraying of strength, a tremor in tone. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently to Blue's. "You held me up when nothing else could," he whispered. "So I'm gonna hold you now." The vet checked in periodically, giving updates in soft tones. The antidote had been administered, but time was working against them. The toxin was fast, invasive. Blue was strong, but even strength has limits. Late in the evening, as the sky outside dimmed and the last visitors cleared the clinic, the vet returned one last time. She crouched beside Shaq, her hands clasped, her voice lower. "I don't mean to overstep," she said, "but I've seen a lot of cases like this. And this feels targeted. If there's anything you know, anyone who may have had a reason." Shaq didn't finish her sentence for her. He just stared at the monitor, then slowly said, "I know who it was." She waited, respectfully. But he didn't elaborate. She didn't push. When she left the room, the air felt heavier than it had all day. The silence wasn't still anymore. It throbbed. Blue's breathing was slower now. His body relaxed in a way that didn't look peaceful. It looked surrendered. Shaq sat still for a long time, hand resting on Blue's side. The rage was there, but it didn't take the shape of yelling or fists. It was colder than that. He wasn't broken. He wasn't even angry in the way people expected. He was something else. Resolve. He thought of Joanna's house, of the smile, the notes, the strategic silence. He thought of the timing, of the patches of yard Blue had avoided, of the way she never looked at him directly, except to remind him of what she thought he was, or wasn't. And that was when it changed. Not because of what was done, but because of how she had done it. Not loudly, not carelessly, but precisely. And that precision told him everything he needed to know. He leaned closer, whispered something no one else could hear. His voice didn't shake now. It was steady, low, focused. And just like that, something inside him died. But it wasn't grief. It was mercy. Because he had offered it, again and again, in silence, in patience, in kindness, and now, it was gone. Not violently, not cruelly, but fully. There was no room left for it. Not after this. As he left the clinic that night, the sky had turned deep charcoal. The streetlights flickered on. The world looked the same, but Shaq didn't feel the same walking through it. He pulled into the driveway and stepped out slowly. The porch light clicked on automatically. Across the street, Joanna's house sat dark, curtains drawn, perfect and cold. He stood there for a long time, staring at it, not moving. And somewhere behind those windows he knew she was watching too. "That woman on your block," Earl said, leaning a little closer like the air itself might snitch. "Joanna Millfield, right?" Shaq nodded, cautious. "She's been on 3 different blocks in the last 5 years. Always in early, always on the HOA board by month 2. By month 6, there's trouble. Something always goes wrong. A broken window, poisoned pets, anonymous calls, but never enough to stick. She's smart, leaves no fingerprints, just chaos." Shaq didn't say anything. He just looked down at the sidewalk. The cracks beneath his boots, the way dust gathered in corners no broom ever touched. Earl continued, softer now. Word is, she left her last place after a neighbor's dog died. Vet said it was old age, but that dog was only 3. Shaq didn't need to hear more. The chill had already settled. The pattern was too clean to ignore now. It wasn't paranoia. It was a loop repeating itself. He was just the next name on a list she never wrote down. Back at home, he went through the security camera feeds. He'd set them up a year ago, just for general peace of mind. 3 cameras, one at the porch, one angled down the driveway, one on the side yard, facing the direction of Joanna's property. All had worked fine until now. The porch cam showed Blue that morning, walking unsteadily before collapsing. The footage was clean, uninterrupted. The driveway feed showed nothing unusual. No intrusions, no strangers. But when he opened the side cam, his stomach dropped. The file was empty. Not corrupted, not missing, just black. The timestamp showed it had recorded. But there was nothing but a blank screen from midnight until noon the day before Blue collapsed. He ran diagnostics. No glitch. The lens hadn't been covered. The software hadn't failed. The only explanation left was interference. Deliberate tampering. Someone had either blocked the signal or scrambled the feed. It wasn't hard to do, for someone who knew what they were doing. A simple jammer bought online. A pocket-sized device. It wouldn't take more than 2 minutes to kill a signal for just long enough. The realization was sharp. Someone had stood near his home, on that side of the yard, the one Blue had avoided, and interfered with the one eye that might have seen them. It wasn't just the poison that was intentional. It was everything. Shaq sat back in his chair, the footage still looping its void on the screen, and whispered to no one in particular. Racism doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears heels, carries a clipboard, and waves at your mailbox. He knew now this wasn't just about Blue. The poison had never just been in the bowl, or the grass, or the soil. It had been in the atmosphere from the start. In Joanna's half-smiles, in the notices, in the shifting gazes of neighbors, once warm, now hesitant. This was a performance, and Joanna had written the script, but she hadn't counted on him being patient. She hadn't counted on him being quiet. She hadn't counted on him listening. So Shaq began his own performance. The first thing he did was adjust the camera angles. He added 2 more, one disguised in a bird feeder, another buried near the corner post of his fence. Both had night vision. Both had motion sensors. No lights, no sounds, just quiet observation. Next, he visited the vet again, not just for Blue's checkups, but to speak with the assistant who'd handled his intake. She confirmed his suspicion. Blue had antifreeze in his system, traceable. Enough to suggest exposure, not ingestion. That meant Blue hadn't lapped it up willingly. He'd stepped through it, sniffed it, absorbed it through touch. Shaq asked her, without naming names, if a person could pour antifreeze into grass without being noticed. She nodded slowly. It's colorless. Odors faint. Disappears fast in daylight. Back home, he checked the grass where Blue had collapsed. The earth there was still disturbed, looser, like something had been spilled and soaked quickly. He scooped a soil sample into a sealed jar, not because he expected it to be admissible in court, but because it was part of the story, part of the record. He started cataloging everything. Each HOA notice now lived in a folder labeled Millfield. Each neighbor's name was scribbled on a wallboard in his garage, with color-coded marks next to those who'd shifted behavior. He didn't judge them. He understood fear. He just didn't want to mistake it for fact. He changed his routine. No more predictable walks. No more porch breakfasts. No signs of weakness. He mowed the lawn with precision, hosed the sidewalk twice a week, repainted the porch railing, let her see him pristine, compliant, civil, the perfect neighbor. Because if Joanna's game was optics, then he'd give her a reflection so flawless it'd be impossible to distort. But the silence between them deepened. She stopped waving, stopped smiling. And once, just once, he saw her watching from behind her curtain, the edge of her blouse visible, her face barely shadowed. But her hands, they were clenched. Shaq knew then that she could feel it. The shift, the presence of something she hadn't anticipated. Resistance that didn't fight back the way she expected. Not loud, not public, just present, unshakable. He didn't need her to confess. He didn't even need to catch her in the act. All he needed was for the story to reach the right ears. Because predators like Joanna don't thrive on action. They thrive on isolation. They count on their targets breaking, reacting, shouting, giving them a reason to flip the script. But this time, there would be no outburst, no headline, just evidence and patience, and the quiet unraveling of a woman who had spent too many years thinking her smile could bury a truth that had just begun to rise. The morning the call came in, Shaq had already been up for hours. The sunrise was still pushing through the blinds when he left the porch and drove to the clinic. He hadn't slept much, not because of fear, but because his mind wouldn't stop replaying the footage, the silences, the blacked-out camera feed, and the weight of something he couldn't yet name. The vet's assistant, a young woman named Claudia, met him outside before the clinic even opened. She had that kind of urgency in her step that told him she hadn't slept either. Her words came quickly, clipped but deliberate. There was a mistake, she said. Not about the antifreeze. Blue's toxicology is clear on that. But we assumed ingestion. Shaq didn't speak. He let her continue, his shoulders squared, eyes unmoving. Claudia pulled out a manila envelope and handed it over. Inside were printed images, scans, blood charts, detailed annotations. The levels in Blue's bloodstream don't match the expected pattern of oral consumption. If he'd eaten it directly, licked it from a bowl or a surface, we'd have seen higher concentrations in the stomach, esophagus, even damage in the mouth lining. But his internal reactions suggest something different. She paused, waited for him to catch up. It was absorbed, she said, likely through the pause. Possibly inhaled as vapor, but not swallowed. The implications arrived slowly, like fog lifting to reveal something terrible beneath. Shaq stared at the report, flipping it over even though there was nothing on the back. The grass. The patch near Joanna's side. The dampness. Blue avoiding it. Blue refusing to cross it. This wasn't about food. It wasn't even about the dog. The poison hadn't been meant for him. Not at first. Or maybe not only him. It had been laid where someone walked. Where someone stood barefoot to water the lawn. Where someone might step out, distracted, barefoot and vulnerable in the morning light. Maybe it was meant for Blue. Maybe for Shaq himself. Or maybe it didn't matter. So long as it hurt something. So long as it reminded someone they weren't welcome. That was the moment it all sharpened. There was no more guessing now. No more watching and waiting for Joanna to blink first. She'd already made her move. Silent, invisible, rehearsed. Now it was Shaq's turn. He spent the next 48 hours, setting things in motion. He called a technician from out of town, someone who didn't ask too many questions. Together they installed 2 high-fidelity microphones. One under the mailbox, the other beneath the porch ledge. Both triggered by sound and motion, not to catch words, screamed in anger. But the little ones, the things said under breath, over phones, in moments where people believed they weren't being heard. Then he placed decoy bowls in the yard. Stainless steel, the kind used for dog food or water, filled with nothing but clear tap water. He positioned them in areas Blue never visited, places visible from across the street, almost too perfect in their placement. He left them out every morning, never touched them himself, never addressed them aloud. They were bait, but not for poison, for attention. Within 3 days, one of them moved half an inch. Shaq checked the camera feed 5 times before he saw it. 3:14 a.m., a shadow crossing the lawn, pausing just out of frame, then fading again. No face, no hand, just movement. Intent, that was enough. He made copies of every video. One set saved to the cloud. One burned to a hard drive. Another printed frame by frame in his garage. Time-stamped, labeled, categorized. He started logging every HOA notice with a new eye. He stopped throwing away the neighbor flyers. He scanned and stored them, tracked their tone, their timing, their authorship. And slowly he began pulling the strings of his own quiet theater. That's when Joanna changed. She began waving again, more than usual. She started smiling wider, walking slower when passing his yard. Her voice got louder during her phone calls, especially when she knew he was nearby. She called across the street once to compliment his roses. Her voice syrupy, a little too high-pitched. She hadn't spoken directly to him in over a month. He answered with a nod. Just a nod. She lingered a second too long. Tilted her head like someone pretending curiosity. Then kept walking. Shaq stood there watching, arms folded, face still. You don't smile that wide, unless you think your opponent's already on the floor, he said quietly to himself. And that was the most dangerous part of all. Joanna believed she'd won. She thought he was retreating, that he'd tucked himself back into the mold she had shaped for him. Quiet, obedient, sidelined. The perfect paper version of a neighbor she could manage with form letters and whispers. But every move she made now, every wave, every lingering stare, every fake interaction, was being archived. Shaq had stopped reacting. Now he was recording. She couldn't feel the difference. But she would. He started speaking to other neighbors again. Casually, on walks, at the corner coffee stand. He didn't mention Joanna. He didn't have to. People volunteered their thoughts without prompting. "I've never seen her at the block meetings," one woman said. "But she files the most complaints. She told me my kids were too loud inside my own house," another neighbor admitted, embarrassed and angry. Someone else mentioned a rumor, a woman on the next block, who had moved away after Joanna accused her of stealing garden decor. There had been no proof. Just tension. Just exhaustion. Everyone had a version of the story. None of them had compared notes. Until now. Shaq didn't need them to fight for him. He just needed them to remember what she was capable of. Back home, he pulled the manila envelope from the vet again and slipped it into a new folder. This one unmarked, locked in a drawer beneath a toolbox no one ever touched. It held the second copy of Blue's medical report, untouched by the clinic's system, handed to him in person by Claudia off the books. Because sometimes justice doesn't come through courtrooms. Sometimes it comes through pressure. He knew Joanna didn't fear confrontation. She feared exposure, public discomfort, loss of control. That's what she tried to prevent at all costs. That's why she never accused, never shouted, never dirtied her hands. But Shaq wasn't going to knock on her door. He was going to let her feel it, slowly, consistently, until her perfect little empire began to crack from the inside. The poison, he now understood, wasn't just in the yard. It was in the HOA policies she twisted to punish dissent, in the scripts she whispered to friendly ears, in the way she orchestrated silence from the people around her, replacing connection with cautious civility. Blue wasn't the first victim. He likely wouldn't have been the last. But now, someone was watching back. And this time, the silence wouldn't protect her. The burn file wasn't for revenge. That was never the plan. He didn't want Joanna ruined. He wanted her seen. Not through whispers or coded looks, but with the kind of clarity that couldn't be twisted. Her pattern wasn't a mistake. It was method. And patterns, when you chart them right, become undeniable. He started with the videos. Every moment he'd captured over the last few months. The camera footage, the shadows, the bowl that moved half an inch in the night. He clipped timestamps, sorted files, labeled folders with quiet precision. There was no rage in his actions, only rhythm. Next came the audio. The porch mic had picked up enough. The murmur of Joanna's voice in clipped conversations with passing neighbors. Tone was everything. You could hear the control in her inflection, the passive aggression wrapped in sugar. "He means well." I'm sure he didn't intend to violate code. It must be difficult for someone like him to adjust to structure. The phrasing was always soft, the poison always diluted. But he built a timeline: letters, reports, statements. He mapped when the first HOA citations arrived, when the shift in neighbor behavior began, when Blue collapsed. He even color-coded the file: blue for HOA notices, red for veterinary documentation, yellow for community patterns, green for witness accounts, and gray for everything still unproven. Each document was scanned, printed, backed up to an encrypted drive. He created 3 copies. One sent to his mother, Lucille, along with a handwritten letter. No dramatic warnings, just instructions. "If something happens, give this to the press." The second went to his lawyer, a quiet man in Baltimore who'd represented Shaq during a contract dispute years earlier, and never once broken confidentiality. The third copy he mailed to someone he hadn't spoken to in almost a decade, Charlie Vance, a retired network anchor who'd once promised Shaq, "If you ever have a story no one else will touch, you call me." He enclosed a note that read simply, "This is what we talked about." Shaq didn't expect immediate responses. That wasn't the point. The burn file wasn't a flare. It was a fuse. And now it was lit. 3 days after the final package was mailed, it arrived. A note, folded, unmarked, no envelope, taped neatly to his front door. 4 words, printed in clean, block handwriting. "You're not the only one." The message was clear. And not just because of what it said, but how it was delivered. Quiet, intentional, controlled. This wasn't a prank. It was a breadcrumb. Shaq didn't panic. He didn't call the police. Instead, he walked back inside, scanned the note, filed it into a new folder, labeled parallel threads, then sat down at his dining table and let his mind run the numbers. Someone else had seen it, lived it, tracked it, which meant the pattern stretched farther than his street. He began asking quiet questions, not to the current HOA board. They were already compromised or afraid, but to the old guard, former members, people who had moved out in the last 2 years. It took 3 calls, 2 hang-ups and 1 long silence before he got a hit. The man's name was Kenton Ross, retired school administrator, former HOA secretary, lived on the other end of the neighborhood, in a smaller, more tucked-away section. Shaq approached him casually, knocking on his door with the same quiet presence he carried everywhere now. Kenton answered with caution. But when Shaq introduced himself, something in the old man's face shifted. Recognition or maybe relief. They didn't talk on the porch. Kenton invited him in, locked the door behind them, and poured 2 glasses of water before saying anything. She did it to me too, Kenton said finally. 2 years ago, different tactics, same outcome. He explained it in pieces. How Joanna had first volunteered to help with records, then rewritten by laws behind closed doors. How she'd altered complaint logs, deleted entries, reshuffled meetings to disqualify certain votes. Kenton had called her out once. Publicly, he was voted off the board within a month. A formal email cited failure to maintain cooperative tone. He tried to protest. The HOA legal counsel sided with her. She had the paperwork. He had concerns. And in Joanna's world, concerns without evidence were just noise. She doesn't need power, Kenton said. She needs obedience. And she knows how to get it. Fear, confusion, isolation. Her favorite tools. He admitted to writing the note on Shaq's door. Said he waited until late. Wore gloves. Watched the cameras. I couldn't just sit back this time, he said. Not after what I heard about the dog. Shaq didn't confirm or deny. He didn't need to. They talked for another hour. Shared notes. Confirmed overlaps. Joanna hadn't just poisoned lawns. She'd poisoned records. Truth itself. Before leaving, Shaq asked him one question. If I brought this out in the open, would you back me? Kenton didn't hesitate. She silenced me once. I don't intend to let her do it twice. The pieces were falling into place now. Not just a collection of wrongs, but a mosaic. A framework of control that spanned blocks, names, seasons. Joanna's power didn't come from position. It came from people's reluctance to speak. Her empire was built on hesitation. Shaq drove home slowly, that evening. Not cautious, deliberate. As he passed Joanna's house, he noticed something new. A landscaper's truck. Not one from the usual local company. This one was unfamiliar. The man working the yard was efficient, silent, meticulous. He didn't look up. Joanna stood at her window, watching him. And maybe, just maybe, watching Shaq too. He pulled into his driveway, parked, and sat in the truck for a while. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. The air was quiet again, but not still. He'd spent weeks building a case. Not for court, for truth. The kind that outlasts arguments. The kind that doesn't need a verdict to be real. The burn file was ready. But now, the fire was spreading. And Joanna had no idea how many people were holding matches. It started with a single post. No name, no photos, no headlines, just words. Simple, unassuming, the kind you scroll past, unless you're paying attention. My dog was poisoned in our neighborhood. The vet confirmed it was intentional. No proof, no arrests, just silence. But I've collected the patterns, and I'm not the only one. If this has happened to you, or almost happened, speak up. This isn't about the dog, it's about the system that lets this keep happening. Signed, just a neighbor. The post went live on a quiet Wednesday morning, tucked into a long thread on a community forum designed for yard sales and bake sales. The kind of place where lawnmower recommendations were more common than confessions. But someone read it, then someone else, then a user commented, something like this happened to my sister's pit bull 2 towns over. Then another. Wait, was this in Rosebud Heights? I got an HOA letter the same week my dog started limping. By the end of the day, it had over 2,000 views. By the end of the week, it had crossed platform screenshots shared on Reddit. Reposted on Facebook, whispered about in group chats, reshared in true crime communities with captions like, "Look into this one. Feels deeper than it looks." Still, Shaq remained anonymous. The post wasn't about celebrity or sympathy. It wasn't written like a complaint. It read like a case file, organized, unemotional, razor sharp. The power of it wasn't in who wrote it. It was in how true it sounded. The cadence, the calm, the unmistakable tone of someone who wasn't crying for help, but laying groundwork. Someone, an internet sleuth, maybe a former neighbor, zoomed in on the mention of HOA citations, matched dates, cross-referenced HOA newsletters, archived online, and suddenly, a name surfaced. Joanna Millfield. It took just one person to post it. From there, the wildfire caught wind. Someone dug up old HOA rosters, 3 neighborhoods in 5 years, each with whispers, each with early resignations, quietly settled neighbor disputes. One thread uncovered a now-defunct Facebook page from a woman who'd posted anonymously years ago. "They let her take my dog. The system protected her. I just wanted to move on." Joanna had never faced criminal charges, never even had a formal complaint stick. Her tactics had been legal adjacent, always bending rules just far enough to break people without breaking laws. Until now. Until this post. Because this time, someone had receipts. It wasn't long before a local news outlet picked it up. A weekend reporter on the community beat, looking for a Sunday filler, stumbled across the post and reached out to the forum moderator. Within hours, the headline went live. "Poison, Power in a Silent Neighborhood. HOA Drama Turns Dark in Rosebend Heights." They didn't name names, initially. But the article connected dots. The dog's poisoning. The history of HOA conflict. The anonymous post. It referenced a female board member with a record of non-transparent HOA behavior. That was enough. People filled in the blanks. Shaq watched the news clip on mute, standing in his garage, arms folded. The screen flickered with a map of the neighborhood, zoomed in just enough to make the blocks recognizable. Blue, still recovering, rested quietly by his feet. He didn't need to hear the sound. He already knew what was being said. And then came the responses. Emails poured into the news station. Stories from past neighbors, former dog owners, ex-board members. One woman claimed Joanna had threatened her with legal action after she called the city over suspicious pet activity. Another said Joanna had tried to evict her for hostile eye contact during a board meeting. The tide had turned. But the real shift came when someone leaked the vet report. It wasn't Shaq. It was Claudia, the tech who'd handled Blue's care, the one who'd seen too many quiet injustices and finally had enough. She sent the toxicology report to the news station anonymously, along with a brief message. "This dog didn't ingest poison from food. It was soaked into a lawn. This wasn't negligence. It was targeted. Someone knew what they were doing." That email hit the newsroom an hour before Joanna's scheduled press conference. She'd organized it last minute, a PR move her attorney probably insisted on. The goal was damage control. Frame it as misunderstanding. Blame internet hysteria. Appear calm. Appear in control. The podium was set up on her porch. Her house, immaculate as ever, made for a pristine backdrop. She stood in front of it, like she belonged on a real estate brochure, flanked by 2 HOA members, who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Cameras rolled. She began. Her voice was steady at first, controlled, carefully measured concern. "I've served this community with grace and diligence for the past 2 years," she said. "What we're seeing now is an unfortunate case of social media misinformation spiraling out of control. I had no involvement in any harm caused to a neighbor's pet, and I have full faith in the HOA's protocols." She smiled, but it was tighter now. Strained. That was when the reporter raised her hand, notepad in one hand, phone in the other. "Can you speak to the leaked toxicology report confirming that the dog's poisoning was via antifreeze absorbed through the paw pads, and that it was poured directly onto the lawn?" Joanna's face faltered. Just for a moment. A microsecond. But the camera caught it. Her mouth opened, closed. She glanced off camera. Her voice dropped. "I haven't seen that report. I can't comment on unverifiable. It's from the clinic directly." The reporter interrupted. "The same clinic you referenced in your HOA memo last week. They've confirmed its authenticity." The silence stretched too long. Her next words were shaky. "Well, I can't respond to leaked medical documents. If this turns into a legal issue, my attorney will respond accordingly." but the damage was done. Not just to her reputation, but to the illusion of poise. Her voice had cracked, the tremble in her hand as she adjusted the microphone, the stiffness in her shoulders. It all gave her away. The cameras kept rolling. Shaq didn't watch it live. He stood instead at the end of his street, leaning against a lamppost, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on Blue's leash. The pit bull sat beside him, alert but calm. A few neighbors passed with polite glances, eyes flicking toward the Millfield house, but quickly away again. He didn't need the footage. He could feel it. Joanna's empire had always been built on silence, on playing the role perfectly, manipulating narratives without ever saying anything directly. But now, the story had been taken from her. The script she'd always controlled, twisted. Shaq closed his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But the words echoed in his mind like a drum beat, steady and full. He didn't speak a single word. But the truth? It sang louder than sirens. The fall didn't happen overnight. People like Joanna don't disappear in a blaze. They unravel quietly, carefully, piece by piece, until all that's left is the echo of control slipping through their fingers. It began with the lawsuit. One of the former neighbors from her previous community, an older man with a sharp memory and a grieving heart, filed first. His dog had died under eerily similar circumstances. No charges had ever been brought. No investigation ever stuck. But now, with the toxicology report from Blue's case floating through the media, and new witnesses coming forward, the story had legs. He filed a civil suit, negligent endangerment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Then came another. A woman from 2 towns over accused Joanna of tampering with HOA documents and threatening eviction after she questioned neighborhood budgeting. Her claim? Joanna had intentionally falsified a maintenance record to justify fines against her. She had paperwork, emails, copies of now deleted entries. And suddenly, the house of mirrors began to crack. Joanna resigned from the HOA board before the ink dried on the second filing. The official statement cited unprecedented public scrutiny and a desire to preserve community harmony. But the truth was simpler. She was being cornered, not with noise, but with evidence. Her real estate holdings, 3 mid-scale rental properties she operated quietly under an LLC, began to bleed. Past tenants surfaced. Complaints long buried found breath. Mold cover-ups, refusal to repair units, verbal intimidation masked in business speak. She had built her empire the same way she'd run her street, on silence and technicalities. Now neither protected her. And still, Shaq said nothing. He never posted a follow-up. Never revealed that just a neighbor was him. He didn't stand in front of cameras or write op-eds. Instead, he turned inward to the place that had always mattered more than proving a point: community. The block had been tense for months, everyone waiting for the next shoe to drop. But once Joanna stepped away from her role and the press moved on to louder scandals, something shifted. It began with the kids. One Saturday morning, Shaq rolled out an old rusted basketball hoop and set it up in the cul-de-sac. No invitation, no flyer, just the quiet clunk of a ball, echoing through the morning haze. 2 kids from down the block came first, hesitant at the edge of the driveway. He passed them the ball. No speeches, no rules, just play. Then came a few more. By the following weekend, parents were dropping off coolers. Someone brought a speaker. A family grilled hot dogs on a portable stove. Shaq organized a cleanup drive. The next weekend. No signups, no sign-in sheet, just gloves, bags, and an open invitation to walk the block and fix what had been fraying. Lawn edges trimmed, old planters replanted, weeds pulled from sidewalks. Laughter started replacing glances over shoulders. And Blue? Blue was healing too. The vet said he'd never fully return to the energy he once had, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. He took slow steps now, napped more in the sun, and followed Shaq's every move with loyal eyes. When the community barbecue came around, a spontaneous collaboration between 5 households, Blue was front and center, lounging beneath the table where the ribs were stacked too high, and the lemonade was never quite sweet enough. Kids pet him like he was royalty. No one mentioned the past, but the presence of healing was thick in the air. Even the neighbors who had once looked away, those who had hesitated when the notices started arriving, who'd watched Shaq from behind drawn curtains, came forward now. Not with apologies, with effort, small gestures, dishes at the potluck, offers to repaint the old bench on the corner. And Shaq accepted all of it. Not because he needed their validation, because he knew rebuilding didn't come from proving people wrong. It came from pulling people back in, gently. The real closure came on a quiet Thursday morning. Shaq was trimming the rose bushes near his porch when he saw the moving truck. Plain, unmarked, backed into Joanna's driveway. There were no neighbors outside, no waving hands, no farewell brunch, just her, alone. Wearing dark sunglasses and a loose gray sweater, Joanna moved slowly from house to truck, lifting boxes one by one. No help, no professional movers, just her and a dolly. The once pristine landscaping looked overgrown. Her flowers had wilted. The edges of the house were beginning to fray, the subtle decay that creeps in when pride no longer fuels presentation. Shaq watched from across the street, not to gloat, not to savor, just to see. And when she lifted the last box, pausing on the edge of the driveway, her shoulders slumped forward, not from the weight of the load, but from something deeper. He turned back to his roses. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her exit wasn't marked by shame or scandal, just silence. And that was fitting, because silence had always been her weapon. Now, it was her echo. The deed transfer would later reveal she sold the house through a shell company, trying to keep her name out of public record. But the neighbors knew. The street knew. And sometimes, that's all truth needs. Eyes that remember. As the truck pulled away and the dust settled, Shaq returned to his porch, Blue curling up beside him, tail brushing against his boot. The sun climbed higher. The block stretched quietly. And in that stillness, a thought passed through Shaq's mind. Not angry, not bitter, just true. Hate isolates itself. Love multiplies. He didn't say it aloud, but the block felt it anyway. Shaq sat in his usual spot, his frame filling the space like it had always belonged there. No phone in his hand, no papers on his lap, just stillness. Blue was at his feet, curled but alert, ears twitching at every breeze, one paw resting over the other in that elegant, dignified way he'd always had. The scar from the IV line was still visible, a small reminder of what had almost been taken. The street looked different now. Not physically, same cracked sidewalks, same mismatched fences. But the air had softened. It was no longer tight with unsaid things. The silence that had once hung over this cul-de-sac like fog had been replaced by something lighter, something human. Laughter floated from one of the backyards. A hose hissed from 2 houses down. The sound of a screen door bouncing on its frame followed the scent of barbecue smoke drifting on the wind. Life again. 2 kids rode their bikes down the sidewalk, swerving wildly but somehow managing to stay upright. They shouted a half-formed game between them, something about racing to the corner mailbox. One of them spotted Shaq and waved, nearly falling off his handlebars, as he tried to brake mid-sprint. Shaq lifted 2 fingers in a casual wave. The boy grinned and sped off again. Blue didn't stir much, just watched with a steady eye, and gave one contented huff as they passed. Across the street, a neighbor who once avoided eye contact walked out with a tray of lemonade for her teenage daughter and her friends. She glanced up, met Shaq's gaze, and smiled. This time, it was real. Not the tight kind, not forced or cautious, just honest. She raised the tray slightly in greeting, and he nodded back. The breeze picked up, lifting the edge of the curtain beside the front window. The air was warm, but not heavy, the kind that felt like it had rinsed away something bitter. Behind him, the house remained quiet, peaceful. The folders were all packed away now. The cameras still worked, but he barely checked them anymore. The microphones were turned off. The backup drive stored in a fireproof box in the closet, untouched for weeks. The burn file had done what it was meant to do. Not destroy, not shame, but reveal, illuminate. Truth had a strange way of working. It didn't always arrive in headlines or fireworks. Sometimes it tiptoed in on a whisper, changed a mind, redirected a glance, shifted a streetlight just enough to show what had always been hiding in plain sight. Shaq leaned back in the chair, his arms resting easily, his breathing matched the slow rhythm of the moment. Blue stretched beside him, then settled again, his eyes following a squirrel zigzagging across the yard. No bark yet. Just that poised, predator's patience. One of his back legs twitched with anticipation, but he stayed grounded, loyal to the calm around him. Joanna's house was empty now. The new owners hadn't moved in yet, and the shutters remained drawn, but the energy was gone. The unease that had clung to that property like ivy had withered. No watchers behind curtains, no rules rewritten in the dark, Just a house now. Nothing more. People still talked about what had happened, but not in the way the media did. Not with drama or whispers of scandal. They talked about it with relief, with the quiet understanding of having survived something invisible. The kind of thing that leaves bruises only you know are there. And Shaq? He never once stood up to declare himself the voice behind the post, the hand behind the files, the calm behind the storm. He let the story breathe on its own, let the street heal without having to explain its wounds. Because that's how real truth works. You don't need to shout it, you just let it live. Blue shifted suddenly, lifting his head. The squirrel darted closer, emboldened by curiosity or bad instinct. For a second, it looked like Blue might launch into a chase, but he stayed where he was, only letting out one low, soft bark. Not to scare, not to hunt, just to remind the squirrel whose yard it was. Shaq chuckled quietly, eyes still on the horizon. He took in the block, the air, the weightlessness of a fight finished. They say what happened next shocked everyone, he murmured, almost to himself. But not me. See the truth? It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits. And when it speaks, it changes everything. He didn't need applause. Didn't need a thank you. Just the breeze, the porch and Blue. And that was enough. The squirrel scampered off. Blue's tail thumped twice. And the day rolled forward. Not into fanfare, but into peace. And in that quiet justice rested. Not loud, not grand, but present. Not every story ends in headlines. Some change neighborhoods. Some change us. If this hits something real, stick around. The next truth might be living on your street. Stay curious. Stay aware. Because silence? It's how they get away with it. And here, we don't let that happen.